at the moment, you can't move for books and exhibitions about the Silk Road, the overland trading corridor between Europe and China, powered by Chinese silks, gunpowder, and paper. But not to be too crude about it, ships are bigger than camels. They can carry a lot more stuff. And India, slap bang in the middle between China, West Asia, and Europe, was at the centre of a massive maritime trade powered by the monsoon winds. What kind of cultural and intellectual impact did India have outside of its borders? I'm joined by William Dalrymple, author of The Golden Road, to discuss how India was at the epicentre of the ancient world. We talk about the Roman appetite for pepper, goodness gracious me, and how one lucky rhinoceros stopped Genghis Khan from conquering the subcontinent. Okay, William Dalrymple, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Big pleasure.
So I had so much fun reading this book, and as I got into it...
I had a lot of fun writing it, actually, including one of the nicest 6-month-long holidays of my entire life after COVID.
No one ever says they had a nice time writing a book. Did you not have the pit of self-loathing?
Well, the nice bit, of course, is not actually writing the book, but going off on the travel before writing the book. But it was great, because I spent kind of 20 years writing the same book about the East India Company and the Mughals, 4 different books about that. And this was a complete release into what had always been basically a hobby, something I've loved but never actually specialised in. And it's also sort of connected me with when I was a kid, I used to love archaeology, and I used to spend all my teen holidays on archaeological digs.
Oh, wow.
And then ended up going down another rabbit hole and studying something that would have amazed my teenage self, which was the 18th century, which I thought was very boring and very late. And this is coming back to the stuff I always loved, which is archaeology, early history, the ancient world, but with this new angle to me.
So what was the first seed of the idea for this book?
It was while I was in Angkor Wat, looking at this amazing, extraordinary religious monument, which is the largest Hindu temple in the world, but it's not in India, it's in Cambodia. And I already had my mind blown by that. And I was thinking of how would I formulate something to write, because it's so extraordinary and so unknown to us really in the West. I mean, we know the pictures, but the history is completely opaque. And while I was there, I got a WhatsApp from someone who said, "Have you seen this?" And it was a picture of this newly discovered Buddha's head, found not in India or anywhere that you'd associate with the Buddhist world, but in Egypt.
Oh, wow.
In an Isis temple, with sun rays coming out behind the Buddha's head as if it's a sort of solar deity. So some weird Roman syncretism of the Buddha and Sol Invictus or whatever, or Surya, or I mean, I don't know what's going on there. But what was, apart from being an extraordinary object in itself, the most multicultural object you could imagine, an Indian holy man depicted on white Proconnesian marble from the Marmara Sea, which is now Turkey, found in Egypt in an Isis temple. Apart from that, just in itself being an extraordinary thing, to see how far west Indian ideas were reaching in antiquity, while I was, in a sense, in the extreme east of Indian influence in Cambodia on the Mekong. And I suddenly thought, this is a whole world that we don't know. It's also a world, I discovered pretty quickly, which has been heavily colonized by Indian nationalist ideas. Mm-hmm. And there's this long-standing idea since the 1930s that Indian influence in Southeast Asia was a military conquest. And you had what a historian called R.C. Majumdar, a brilliant historian of the day, described as Hindu colonies in Asia. Now, it's subsequently become very clear that it's actually something much more interesting, which is Hindu and Buddhist and other Indian ideas spreading very thoroughly through Southeast Asia, but without conquest.
We're going to get into that. But the first thing I guess I want to ask you is that the title the Golden Road is a little bit of a misdirection because your focus is on sea lanes rather than
Well, I'd say
overland
sea
routes.
roads.
Sea roads.
which is a legitimate usage. You can say sea roads.
But so what does this shift of focus onto seas and ships, what does that do to the prevailing view of trade between Asia and the West during this period from the kind of, was it like 5th century BC to the medieval period?
So from the very beginning, one of the things that interested me most was, why do we not know this stuff? If it's true, as I'm saying in this book, that India changed the whole face of Asia with its, not just its religious ideas, but its philosophy, its learning, its ideas of cosmology, astronomy, mathematics, dance, sculpture, this whole package of Indian stuff which spreads. If it's true that this is as important as it seems to be, how come we don't know all this? How come that this is not something that we're taught at school? How come it's not something we all know, like we know about Alexander the Great or the British Empire or all the other things that we are brought up with? And there are a number of answers to that, I think. The first is colonialism. We are inheritors of an educational system that has come out of a world where, as Macaulay famously put it, a single shelf of a good English library contains more of worth than the entire native literature of India and Arabia. Now, we laugh at that now, but that
was what my head of department told me when I asked why there wasn't more Indian literature on the course. He was like, well, is there any?
Yeah, exactly. So, yes, there is a great deal, and it's extraordinary. And half the world was suckled on it. Literally, half the world's population today lives in countries where Indian ideas are now or once were dominant. So the easy answer is colonialism, because the British didn't recognise it. But it's actually only half the answer. There are other reasons why we don't know this. And I think partly it's because it's been split into different stories. That the story of Buddhism is connected with this idea of the Silk Road. The spread of Hinduism into Southeast Asia is part of the story of the spread of Sanskrit. The story of Indian mathematics, as far as it's taught at all, and the fact that the zero and the numbers we use every day are Indian, is taught in history of science or something. And these things are all curated in different departments, split up. And particularly at the centre of it, there is this idea which my generation got very excited by, and it was a new idea, amazingly, because it's now become so mainstream, is this idea of the Silk Road. This summer in London, there is a major exhibition, which I'll be seeing this afternoon at the British Library, and another major exhibition at the British Museum about the Silk Road, which is focused on China. And there are these maps you see where there's this more or less horizontal road leading from Chang'an or Xi'an, the terminus of the Silk Road on the South China Sea, on the far east of China, right through what's now Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Iran, Turkey, and it lands at Antioch or somewhere on the Mediterranean. And actually, that idea of the Silk Road, which is so dominant now, is not an ancient idea. Marco Polo doesn't talk about it. The Chinese don't talk about it. There is no mention of it before 1880, when a German colonial geographer called Baron von Richthofen, the grandfather of the First World War flying ace, the Red Baron, came up with this idea, the Seidenstraßen, which he put into a map of a potential colonial railway that he was planning to build from Berlin to what was then Peking. And it doesn't appear in English until 1936, when a Nazi sympathizer called Sven Hedin writes a book called The Silk Road, which comes into English. And by the 1980s, when I was a kid at university, it was beginning to be propagated. And my first book was about following Marco Polo down the Silk Road. But the Silk Road, in my opinion, does not really have any reality on the ground until the Mongols smash an enormous hole through the middle of Asia in the 13th century. Before that, and particularly in the classical period, the great age of Rome of Augustus, the aftermath of Antony Cleopatra committing suicide, is that Egypt is appropriated by Rome, colonized, which gives Egypt and Roman Empire a sea border with India, because of the monsoon winds. It only takes 2 months to sail with a sailing boat between a port on the Red Sea and a port in Kerala or a port in Gujarat or on the Indus.
I mean, this is one of the things which you write about, which is all of these luxuries which were entering into the Roman world, whether it's pepper or silks or rhubarb, which, by the way, completely fucking spun me out. Because
rhubarb and cream couldn't be more English.
There is nothing more English than rhubarb and custard. And like, my husband's from Yorkshire, and this morning I was like, did you know that rhubarb is from India? And he was like, you can't have everything.
It sounds like you've been in a kind of Sanjeev Bhaskar sketch.
Yeah, no, I'm sick of you saying that everything is Indian.
Leonardo da Vinci, Indian.
Yeah, Indian. I mean, that was my grandmother. She like Henry VIII, Indian.
We had Sanjeev at the launch.
Oh, really?
And I had him do and he did a very funny. I do a podcast called the Empire Podcast. And he said it is an Indian podcast called the Umpire Podcast. And then he did his own sort of bespoke sketch for...
But you've got all these Roman writers who link silk and the fact that it's so sensuous and you can see so much of a woman's body through it to this idea of, well, we're decadent and we're weak and look at us, we're kind of on the edge of depravity.
The specific idea that the Roman writer you're talking about is complaining about, this is Pliny. And Pliny is a very sort of familiar figure. He's that peppery colonel or the kind of, the kind of angry admiral propping up a bar at some pub by the sea.
Oh, we've gone soft.
Yeah, and he says, why do you need all this black stuff on your food? What is this pepper that people now, the young now put on their food? And as you said, why would we pay a fortune to bring a see-through material so that these decadent Roman matrons can show off their bodies in parties? Gemstones, we don't need them. And so his argument is that the entire wealth of the Roman world, as he says, India is a drain for all the precious metals of the world, which is a very nice sort of reverse of obviously the 18th and 19th century thing when the West drains the wealth of India into British pockets, into all those national trust houses that now have Indian treasures inside them, like Powis Castle. Mm. But in the first century, Pliny's complaining because he says, we make all this money, we do all this work, we conquer all these countries like Gaul, and then our rich, decadent aristocracy just buy a load of nonsense from India, that pepper, cotton, silks, gemstones, something called nard, which was the basis for Roman perfume, which comes from the Himalayas. I don't know whether you know your Christian Gospels, but in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a scene where Martha massages Christ's feet with nard. And all the other disciples complain, saying that we could have just sold this and given it to the money to the poor. And you're wasting it on him. and this is a measure of how expensive this stuff is. And recently, a papyrus has turned up, which has excited all the economic historians because it contains a detailed invoice for one consignment of goods. It's a very modern document. It's exactly what you take out if you were shipping carpets from India to Bradford today or something. And it has, in a sense, one column saying what's inside the container, another saying its value, and a third column saying the customs take that's going to have to be paid at the border for each one of these things. So it's ivory, nard, pepper, cotton, and silk. And if this one random consignment on one ship called the Hemaplon, we know the name of the ship even, if the Hemaplon had made it to Egypt and they got this crate to the Nile, shipped it up to Alexandria and sold it in Alexandria, the ship owner or whoever was behind this consignment would have been rich enough to buy one of the premier estates in Egypt or indeed central Tuscany and have enough money to join the Roman Senate. So it was clearly a highly risky enterprise to go over the seas. There's pirates, there's shipwrecks, there's all manner of things that can go very badly wrong. You have to borrow money to buy this stuff in the first place. But if you get it back to Rome or to Alexandria, you are in, you're the Elon Musk of Alexandria. You're and if you do it twice, then you can buy up half of Rome.
What was Indian seafaring technology like at this time? Because this is me trying to remember from my Mike Duncan History of Rome podcast, which is where I get all of my information from, which is the Romans basically...
I like the ancients.
Yeah, like about the ancients, also about everything. From my understanding, the Romans reverse engineer, basically, is it Phoenician ship? They reverse engineer.
Very good, Ash. Very good.
Yes, I did English literature, so I only know about the Phoenicians from T.S. Eliot. So like reverse engineer a Phoenician ship, and that's kind of how they end up with like decent enough seafaring technology to, take over the Mediterranean. How does India's seafaring technology match up? Is it that they've got all this stuff, so they don't need to be that good at seafaring technology, the ships will come to them? Or did they have decent enough seafaring technology that they could then expand southeast?
So there's two answers to that. One is that clearly Indians were very proud of their seafaring technology. We have pictures of Indian boats in the Ajanta caves and on coins. But the reality is that unlike quite a lot of other places like Singapore, which have invested money in marine archaeology, which is quite a sort of rich man's game, you have to have a sub and go down and lift this stuff up. And to be honest, the ASI, the Archaeological Survey of India, hasn't simply not put the money in to bring the shipwrecks that we know are there up and examine them. So there's a lot we don't know about ancient Indian seafaring technology. But what we do know is that India had an incredible gift just by its position, geography and meteorology. Now that gift is the fact that the Tibetan plateau ices over every winter and cold winds rake in. Then it thaws in the spring and summer and hot winds blow out. Now that sort of bellows movement, if you like, above India creates the monsoon winds every year, which blow fast in one direction, westwards from the west coast, eastwards from the east coast for 6 months, and then neatly reverse so they can blow you back again. So if you're an Indian sailor, you've only really got to put up a sail and build a very basic sort of canoe, even with an outrig, little outrigger like you get in the Goan fishing boats. And in 2 months' time, you're in Egypt. Then you have to wait a few months for the winds to reverse. And in August, you get back on your boat and you get sucked back all the way to India at speed. 2 months. While it would take 3 years from a camel caravan to go all the way plodding through Persia and the Himalayas and what have you.
And would you say that that's kind of the material basis for the spread of Indian culture, religion, commodities? It's that bellows movement.
That has meant that on the Indian coast, you've always had these trading communities, which in the 19th century, with the British Empire, end up in Kenya and the Swahili coast and everything. But before that, you have long-distance traders since the time of antiquity. Archaeologists have found that when they were poking around with the corpse of poor Ramesses II, which is perfectly preserved, they found grains of Indian pepper up his nose.
Oh, wow.
As part of the mummifying process. But that came from India.
Oh, I thought he was doing like lines of pepper or
snorting
something.
Pepper.
Yeah, it's like, oh, God, I'm really feeling it. For this time period that you're talking about in this book, how much sense does it make to talk about India at all? Because you've got multiple kingdoms, multiple languages. Is there a sense amongst people living on the subcontinent that they're part of something bigger? Or was there a sense of what their identity was, what the polity was, limited to the boundaries of that kingdom?
Very important question, and there are very clear answers to, because it's something that's much discussed. India, unlike China, which for most of its history remarkably is a centralized state with a civil service that operates over the entire width of not quite modern China, but certainly the central Han heartlands. India, in contrast, is, with rare exceptions, as you say, a fractured multiplicity of different kingdoms. There are brief moments during the Mauryans, under Ashoka, again under Chandragupta and the Guptas, again under the Delhi Sultanate, and once again, finally, under the Mughals, when a lot of India is united. But it's moments. In general, it's disunited. And when the famous Chinese monk Xuanzang comes over, he, according to his rights, enters India at Jalalabad, which is now in Afghanistan. And he says, I'm entering India, a region of 70 countries.
Oh.
So he regards it as a very clearly defined region, not as a political unit, but as a region. And from the time of Alexander the Great, he arrives in what's now Pakistan, and he meets all these holy men in Taxila. They sound actually like Jains rather than Hindus because they're naked, which sounds like a Digambara Jain. But whatever they were, the Greeks call them gymnosophists, which doesn't help us understand much more in modern terms. But whoever these holy men were, they give a very clear definition of India, which is one that the British get given 1,000 years later or 2,000 years later. That India is bounded on one side by the Indus, on the other side by the Ganges, and on the south side by the sea. And that's in the Mahabharata as the extent of the lands of Bharata. So that definition of the geographical spread of India from Indus to Ganges, from Ganges to the Kanyakumari and back again is pretty consistent. And there's a very clear image of India as a united holy land, but it's very rarely one political unit.
And so, I mean, like, forgive me for being really Eurocentric, because when I, in my head, thought about Alexander the Great reaching India, the story that you're always told is that it's like summiting Everest, right? Like, look how far this guy went. And you don't really think, well, what was that encounter like? So when Alexander the Great encounters India and Indians for the first time, does he think that he's encountering barbarians? Does he think of it as like a lesser culture than, the Hellenic one he's coming from?
Well, whether it's lesser or greater, I mean, the Greeks, as mass conquerors, always regarded everyone else as barbaroi, as barbarians.
You kind of have to in order to conquer them.
But that doesn't, in a sense, but they also regarded they also regarded the Persians as barbarians. So that's not it's not like they're actually saying these guys are just sort of woolly savages. It just mean they're different. No, the Alexander, we have a very clear set of images of what India was like for the Macedonians, and they are amazed principally by its wealth. It's a very rich land, they say, which is why it's so frustrating for Alexander when his soldiers then say, we want to go home. They fight the one battle against Porus on the Jhelum in the Punjab, and they then say, right, that's it, we're off back home, we've had enough. And Alexander is aware, and he sits down and weeps, because he realizes that the richest conquests are still ahead and he's never going to make them. So from that period, there has always been there lodged in the European mind that this is a very, very rich country.
I mean, you have as a consequence of Alexander the Great reaching India, you've got Sikandar being an Indian name, which is, again, to go back to the Sanjeev Bhaskar sketch, is like Alexander the Great, Indian. I mean, what from the Indian side, what did they think they were encountering when they're encountering the Greeks?
Well, that's the great joke, is that there's no record of the Greeks at all in Indian sources. It's partly because there are very few ancient Indian sources from that period, but it is significant that in the Mahabharata or something, there's not a single reference. You do get later inscriptions from the Buddhist period talking about Yavanas. And there are Tamil poems about Yavana mercenaries and Yavana merchants, and there are inscriptions about Yavanas who convert to Buddhism and dedicate pillars or gateways at Buddhist temples. But there's no sense of reverse excitement, if you said. It isn't like, we've suddenly encountered the Europeans, yippee! The Europeans are far more excited to discover the Indians than vice versa.
Well, it's like one of those things like the Battle of Lepanto. Very, very big deal for Europeans. You ask like a Turk about it, they're like, we've never heard of it. like, not a big deal for us. Like,
so exactly that. And what you then get is, after, you said you're a literature student, after Cleopatra puts her asp to her bosom and the suicide of Cleopatra, Octavius Caesar conquers Egypt. Within a generation, a geographer from Alexandria makes a trip with the governor of Egypt to the top of the Red Sea. And he says, from the port of Myos Hormuz, which we know is not the biggest port, incidentally, on the Red Sea, from this one port, 250 ships a year sail in a fleet to India with the monsoon winds. And so if you then add the other big port, Berenike, to that, then we're talking 500 cargo ships a year going backwards and forwards with these winds.
And what would the equivalent be in camels, right? To compare the overland to the sea route, like one ship, how many camels would that be for a caravan?
Oh, I mean, sort of, 3,000, 5,000. I can't give you the exact
Your
figure,
ship to
but
camel conversion chart in your head.
we need a firm app for this to sort out our conversion rates. But camels obviously can only carry what their saddlebags can fill, and a big seagoing ship of the Roman sort, and particularly the ones in Berenike we know from the births are called elephantine ships because they were made to transport elephants, which is one of the other imports. They used them for the elephants, tigers, and rhinoceroses, as you'll see in Gladiator 2 when it comes out next week, for the sexes.
Oh, wow.
So these are big ships, and you can get a lot of ivory. We don't like to think of it today because of our fears about the extinction of elephants and so on, but that was probably the biggest item of trade of all.
I really want to talk about the spread of Buddhism. What parallels could you draw between the spread of Buddhism and the spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire? Because it sort of seems to me there's something, similar, which is this starts out as sort of a rejection of the contemporary power structure and hierarchy, and then suddenly it becomes a religion of the court. Like how?
So, very interesting question, and one that we can't yet answer, but I'm sure you're actually onto something there. You get Buddhist monasticism from about 150 BC, and there are surviving monasteries, Bhaja outside Pune, Karla, which are excavations into the rock of these enormous halls from this very, very early period. And that spreads up to what's now Pakistan, Afghanistan, into Central Asia. It spreads to the edge of Persia. Now, if, as we now know, you've got large numbers of Indians turning up on the Red Sea ports as sailors, as shippers, as warriors coming for a trip, coming to see another world, we got a huge amount of material in the excavations that have turned up from these Red Sea ports. Then, is it a coincidence that Christian monasticism begins where? On the shores of the Red Sea. St. Anthony of Egypt lived on the Red Sea, as did St. Paul the Hermit, the first two Christian monks.
Okay, now we're getting close to Christianity, Indian.
Sanjeev Bhaskar was right all along.
So, that's an interesting thought. Which is
one reviewer ticked me off actually for saying that I make the joke of Sanjeev Bhaskar at the Indian, saying Leonardo da Vinci Indian, and then by the end, I'm more or less saying universities Indian, and everything else.
At that time, did Indian rulers consider the spread of Buddhism to be something akin to the spread of soft power? Did they go, this is actually in our interests that so many people are converting in far-flung corners of our world, in Southeast Asia, China, Japan?
We don't have anything like that, and I don't think that's how it worked. What we have is people doing well for themselves by traveling. So if you're a merchant, the first thing you do is trade with Rome. That goes high. Sometime in the 5th century, Rome goes down. What does Attila the Hun demand, incidentally, as ransom from Rome? £10,000 of Indian pepper. He doesn't ask for Chinese silk. He asks for £10,000 as the most valuable sort of thing he can ask from the city. So after Rome goes down, almost the last Indian product to make it to Northern Europe is some of the red garnet jewellery in the Sutton Hoo treasure found in 5th century East Anglia. And those contain red garnets from Rajasthan.
Oh, wow.
And that's kind of the last shipment to reach our shores for 1,000 years. There's little bits may make it eventually via Baghdad or other Vikings or something. But the regular export of, for example, Roman Indian pepper, which reaches Hadrian's Wall on a regular basis, that ends by the 5th century. So there's an economic crisis in India, because they're not getting the gold that they used to get. So they have the Tamil merchant guilds who are getting their act together by this stage and have their own military. They even have their own assassins to track down anyone that kills their members. It's a great, rather sinister idea, like Game of Thrones.
Netflix commissioned that. I want to see the Tamil assassins.
The Tamil, can you imagine them? There is one bonkers film where Aishwarya Rai turns up teaching martial arts on Hadrian's Wall at this period, incidentally, but well worth looking up. But anyway, back to
So do
the
they
real world.
turn southeast?
They turn east, exactly. And so you begin to get in Indian texts like the Ramayana, in their final form, and the Mahabharata, references to Savarna Bhumi. Savarna Bhumi is Southeast Asia. That whole landmass is Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. And particularly, you have a reference in the Ramayana where Sugriva, the Monkey King, says to Hanuman, you must go to Savarna Dvipa, the island of gold, which is probably Sarawak, which had gold mines. And so you start finding little Tamil gold workers' tools with Tamil inscriptions from about the 5th and 6th century. Just as Rome has gone down, these guys now have to work a bit harder to get their gold, and they have to go down to Southeast Asia. So from the 5th century, you get, first of all, a few inscriptions, then you start getting wooden Buddhas, then finally you get little tiny handheld images of Vishnu. By the 6th century, you've got large images of Vishnu, incidentally with a Khmer physiognomy. They're not looking Indian. These guys are looking much more like Southeast Asians. And finally, you get temples, initially very clearly in the Pallava style from southern India, but later going off on their own trajectories. And then you get something even weirder. You mentioned how fractured India was. India remains fractured for much of this period, meaning that you can raise some big temples, particularly if you're a Pallava or a Chola. But in Southeast Asia, you've got the Sri Vijaya Confederacy, which is this sort of sea lords, again, rather Game of Thrones, these sort of merchant lords who run Java and Sumatra and tax shipping going to China through the Malacca Straits. And these guys are super rich and can afford to build the same sort of thing, but on a bigger scale. So first you get Borobudur, which is the largest Buddhist monument in the world and the most sophisticated Buddhist monument in the world, built in the 9th century. Then finally, and most famously, you get Angkor Wat in the 12th century, which is about 10 times the size of any of the Chola temples. It's 4 times the size even of the Vatican City. And that's just the area within the moat.
So you said that there was a prevailing theory that Indian expansion, or the expansion of its sphere of influence into Southeast Asia, that initially everyone thought it was military and it was violent. And then what you're arguing is that, well, actually it wasn't. Of course, then you've got the Chola invasions in the 11th century, I think. So what happened?
So that, just to qualify that. So what you're getting is armed trade.
Okay.
So you've got the merchant guilds who clearly got their own warriors traveling with them, because if you're traveling with gold and gemstones, of course you're going to get pirates.
You want a guy with a big sword.
So, and there is some evidence that you even get a bit like early East India Company forts on the coast of, Chennai or Madras or Bengal, Calcutta, that you're getting the merchant guilds running their own little fortification as well as having their own thing. But then it's not a conquest. They are the guests of these merchant kings in Southeast Asia. And in due course, you get the Cholas. Historians are divided on this, and there are nationalist Indian historians who would call it what you just called it, an invasion. Most historians opt for the slightly more neutral raids.
Okay,
raids. So the Cholas, who are these extraordinary, very brilliant rulers of Tamil Nadu, conquer Sri Lanka, burning, incidentally, a lot of the Buddhist monuments there, such as Anuradhapura, seizing their jewels. And we have this in the Sri Lankan chronicles, bewail this looting. And then there's one inscription on the big temple in Tanjore, which says that the great king Rajendra Chola sent a war fleet out to Savarnabhumi and attacked this place, that place. And there's a list of about 15 ports that he's meant to have attacked and brought back loot. There's 1 or 2 references to a viceroy, but the general scholarly opinion, because these guys are still sending ambassadors out to China only 2 or 3 years later, which is implying that it's not over. They may have lost, may have had their city looted or something, but certainly it sounds more like a raid than a conquest. So with that one exception, where you've definitely got a military expedition, people putting horses into boats and jumping off a boat with their swords waving and spears flying and archers and all the rest of it. With that one exception of the Cholas for 1016, 1025, almost all Indian contact with Southeast Asia is peaceful. And you get the first merchants, and then, very important, you get the Brahmins. Why do the kings of Southeast Asia want Brahmins? Because they offer not only a link with the gods, you're not just the local strongman, you're Mahendra Varma, so you are protected by Mahendra, or Surya Varma, protected by the sun god Surya. You're also, these guys are literate, so they bring the Pallava script, they do administration. Why do the Brahmins come? Because they get paid, given estates, and given princesses, which is a pretty good package as far as the Brahmins are concerned. So you get something for everyone. The merchants get their trade, the Brahmins get jobs and wives, the Southeast Asian rulers get administration by experts.
So why wasn't it more military? Was it just that there was an easier and more mutually beneficial deal available? Or was it that it would have been actually quite difficult to preserve your lines of supply and stuff when you've got a sea invasion?
Well, it's not, as sometimes Indian nationalists like to imagine, because Indian religion is terribly peaceful, because unlike, again, the imagined ancient India of peace and prosperity, there's extreme violence in Indian history. If you read the battles of the Pallavas and the Chalukyas, they're constantly wasting each other's cities and raping each other's women and destroying holy temples. And this is going on very energetically, and there are many inscriptions. And that's this. And equally, both the Pallavas and the Cholas conquer Sri Lanka very violently and take the goodies from there. I suppose it's not an easy thing to do a military expedition to Southeast Asia. And
really hard to invade islands.
Yeah, it's quite hard. But also, if you're making lots of money by trading with them, and they've got gold that you can buy very easily, and the merchant guilds are very successfully channeling that back home, you don't really need to.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
What stops the expansion of the Indosphere, as you call it? Why does it stop?
So there's one other major thing before we do the decline, which is numbers.
Oh, okay, numbers.
Very important. And again, so every Indian uncle knows this, but the numbers that we call Arabic numbers in the West are Indian numbers, and the Arabs get them from the Indians. We get them from the Arabs, which is why we call them Arabic numbers, but their place of origin is India. And at a time when in Europe you're still getting long multiplication with MCVVXV1 times MCVVV1.
Does my head in just thinking about it.
The Indians have got 10 symbols, one of which is 0, which makes it all much easier. And they've got decimal place value and tens, 100,000, tens of thousands, and all this sort of stuff. And those ideas spread first to the Arab world. By a stroke of luck, the first viziers in Baghdad are former Buddhists who are Sanskrit literate and know all this stuff. And these guys, they're a family called the Barmakids, send a mission to Sind, and in 776, the Sind Raja, who wants peace with this enormous, very fierce empire, sends the works of Brahmagupta, who's this early Indian mathematician. It seems to be a sort of compilation of 2 of his books, which the Arabs call the Sind Hind. And this becomes the basis for Islamic maths and astronomy. It's simplified and clarified by a genius called Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi is from what is now northern Uzbekistan. And he writes a book which has a long, unwieldy title of the Book of Indian Mathematics According to Completion and Balancing. Now, that's too much of a mouthful in any language.
Sounds like a real page turner.
and so it gets known very widely as algebra, from which we get the word algebra. And his name, Al-Khwarizmi, the man from Khwarazm, which is Khiva, northern Uzbekistan, becomes the basis, Al-Khwarizmi becomes the basis for our word algorithm.
God damn it.
So there is the ultimate Sanjeev Bhaskar
Oh my God,
bullseye.
it really is.
Algorithm, Indian. Algebra, Indian.
Oh my God. But so let's talk about
the decline.
The decline. So why does it stop? Is it just that, you've got these other hugely complex, well-armed, organized societies hemming in the Indosphere? Is it just that, I don't know, that you've got the rise of the Mongols? Like, what's going on?
Two things, and you've already touched on both. So the first thing is in the 1100s, you get a bunch of Turks, and the inscriptions specifically call them Turushka, or occasionally Lord of the Horses. And these guys are new converts to Islam, pretty rough bunch of nomads, still tough, use horse archers. And they first overwhelm the Punjab, capture Lahore, and then they capture Delhi in, 1192. And so you're getting an invasion of a bunch of quite rough people who've got no interest at all in speaking Sanskrit, like the earlier generations had longed to do. And Sanskrit by this stage has spread all the way from Kandahar in Afghanistan through to sort of Bali and Java and Indonesia. These guys are not interested in that. And then you get a second blow a generation later when the Mongols don't conquer India, but conquer everywhere else in Asia. And so you get
But they get really far down, like into Burma, kind of.
There's one little raid into Burma, but the Khaljis, who are the Delhi sultans, successfully fend off the Mongols, including an extraordinary moment when the Mongols come and invade Delhi, and, well, actually the Tughlaqs let loose the sluices of this hydraulic system that they developed, and the Mongols are swept away in a sort of tidal wave. It's very impressive.
I thought ditches. I thought like horses versus ditches. Dig a good ditch.
A lot of all that. And then there's this other moment, according to one source, when Genghis himself, who would have been obviously the big mother of all disasters, he comes through the Punjab and he sees a rhinoceros and he thinks it's some sort of devil and turns away and instead destroys Poland in the end.
Thank God for that rhino.
But for that rhino.
Really took India a solid.
But the result of all this is twofold. One, you've got a hostile border now between India and the Mongol Empire, which stops traders passing over it. So what had been a very porous route for Indian monks and holy men going backwards and forwards to the northern half of the Indosphere is now cut. The second thing that happens is that a lot of the highly educated scholars and writers and teachers who had been living in what was the great caravan cities of Balkh and Merv and all these wonderful places in Central Asia, a lot of them flee to Delhi. And Persian becomes the language of government, not just initially in Delhi, but also eventually in the next 200 years, the rest of India, including Hindu India. It's the diplomatic language, it's Persian. So it isn't that the Sanskrit world disappears. It's never disappeared. It's still there now. But it's subsumed beneath a second layer, like sediment falling down to the sea. And then, of course, later on, you get the English, the East India Company, and there's a third layer. And you can look in this a variety of ways. If you're a Hindu nationalist like Narendra Modi, you can look at it and say 1,000 years of slavery. I, as an outsider, and I, in a sense, don't have a dog in this race, I'm coming from Scotland. To me, it's the richness of Indian society that you've got all this amazing Sanskrit stuff, all this amazing Taj Mahal and Mughal miniatures above that. And finally, you've got all these amazing people who can like Salman Rushdie, who can write English better than English, or Arundhati Roy. So it's a very rich layer cake. But as we know, the Indian nationalists have made a great deal of political capital saying that this is slavery, which I don't think is historically accurate, though it's certainly true that the initial invasions of the Turks in the 12th century was accompanied by temple destruction and a lot of iconoclasm. When you go around somewhere like Madhya Pradesh today, and a lot of the early temples just have their faces smashed in of all the idols and so on. So there is, as you know, a big culture war in India at the moment. We've got a Hindu nationalist government running the country.
And
also
this is all tells
very...
a particular story about, there have been these Muslim hordes which have, invaded India, suppressed the culture, and they want to do it again.
Yeah, and that is a popular narrative, partly because a generation of left-leaning intellectuals after independence were so horrified by the violence of partition that they slightly downplayed in the history books the destruction that did take place. Just like when the Normans took Anglo-Saxon England. A great deal of destruction took place. There was a lot of, pillage, burning, looting and raping. And a new world, the Norman world, was built over the Anglo-Saxon one in the same way in 12th century.
I suppose the difference is, though, is that with telling the story of the harrying of the North or something like that, no one really holds it against the French because it's not a live political issue.
Correct.
Whereas when you're telling the story of temple destruction by Muslims within the context of post-partition, or you're trying to tell that story now when you've got, love jihad, conspiracy theories and all that kind
Correct.
of thing, how do you write history books which tell difficult truths in political context like that?
So this was the big challenge writing this book. And also there's another challenge, which is that you've got this sort of weird thing whereby Mughal history is now identified with sort of lefty Marxist historians like Irfan Habib, while ancient history, the period of ancient glory, which the BJP and the RSS look back to as the pure, unadulterated wonder of the past, is the dream period of the Hindu right. And the challenge writing this book is, in a sense, to strip away both mythologies, to admit that a lot of temple destruction did take place in the 12th century, but also to sort of hold up that amazing things happened in Hindu India, and we shouldn't be ashamed to say it just because the far right are obsessed with it. So I've tried to tell a version in this book which provides no historian is neutral, but I am an outsider still, despite living there for 40 years. To try and give as neutral a picture as I possibly can of an extraordinary period of history, which for various reasons is not well known, and where it is known in India is often mythologized. So you get a lot of old uncles talking about nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata, and yes, and sort of and the flying, the gods moved around in helicopters, and the rishis had the internet. So it's very easy to obviously to take and plastic surgery in the Vedas and this.
But I mean, it comes from. I was thinking this about the Sanjeev Bhaskar sketch, which is the Indian uncle pointing at everything and saying Indian. There's a tragedy in there, which is this is a man
Correct.
who's been told you've got no culture, or if you do, it's inferior, and you've got no history.
Correct.
And so this is somebody saying, no, I do have history.
And also there is this sense that, the Indian uncle is correct in saying that, this is an extraordinary culture. The Indians did invent a lot. It's true. But it's become so discredited by wild claims about atomic weapons and the Mahabharata and the rest of it that no one takes it seriously. So I'm trying to do something which will probably lead to the book being hated on both sides, but in a sense, wind back into a factual, realistic narrative what ancient India did achieve, but also to tell the left in India, this is just because the right love this period, it doesn't mean it's not an absolutely extraordinary period that you should be very proud of. That extraordinary things happened, and it's actually true that the story of this has been suppressed, partly by academic fashion, partly by the story of the Silk Road, partly by colonialism. There's a whole variety of reasons we don't know this, but we don't, and it's important you do know it. So I've tried to find a way of writing this battlefield, this culture war history, in a way that's accessible, full of characters. It's got a quarter of this book is footnotes, because this is such a contested period. There's nothing which I can't back up with serious sources. And so far, I have to say, I was very nervous about this book because it's a period which I had no idea anyone was interested in or not, because frankly, no one's written a book about it since A.L. Basham's The Wonder That Was India in the 1940s, 50s. And partly also because it is such a minefield. But I have to say, this weekend, number 1 in India.
Nice.
And number 4 in Britain. So far, so good.
I've got one last question for you. We were joking about rhubarb and that my brain just was completely scrambled by finding out that it was from India. There's a really famous Stuart Hall paragraph from, I think it's Old and New Identities, Old and New Ethnicities, where he says, I'm the sugar at the bottom
That's
of the
English
English cup of tea.
That's a very Bengali intellectual reference, if I may say.
It's the most Bengali thing about it. And it says, well, some others are the tea itself. Through writing this book, or from your 40 years of living in India, has it made you reflect on Britishness and what Britain is and what it means to be British in a different way?
Living in India definitely has. And that's why, in a sense, I spent the last 20 years writing about the colonial period. There's 4 books, which now in a box set called the Company Quartet, which does the story of the East India Company, which is this an extraordinary story too. It's how one British business from one office in London takes over the richest country in the world.
On a skeleton staff as well. Not many people.
On a skeleton staff, using largely Indian mercenaries.
And did it make
And
you...
paid for by money borrowed from Jain merchants in Calcutta.
I didn't know that.
Marwaris, and the Jains lend the monies. And so it's the one thing that East India Company is clever about is it always repays its debts on time, which is not true of a lot of Indian rulers. So even if you have a heroic Maratha warlord, he might just hang up the moneylender by the ankles if he asks for his money back with interest. But the Brits looted, pillaged, raped, looted, did all the stuff, but they repaid their debts on time.
I mean,
so the
what
Marwaris
did it make you
loved
think
them.
about British identity and the composition of Britishness? Because I suppose when I think about Britishness, I go back to the canon, I think about Chaucer and I think about Shakespeare, and then I find all of these international thumbprints all over these quintessentially English texts.
Well, what's fascinating is in a sense looking at how composite language English is, because right back in your early Chaucer, you'll find the word pepper, which is originally a Tamil word, or ginger, which is also a Tamil word. Tamil and Sanskrit are there very early on in the English language. And then in the 18th century, it's just overwhelmed by bungalows and cummerbunds and pajamas and all the rest of it.
Hooligans? Thugs?
Thugs, definitely. So there is a deep, ancient link between these cultures. And one of the plus points of the English language is that it is a language which has been allowed to absorb all this, unlike French, which is often quite a fiercely policed language.
Oh, Spanish as well. It had a very strong sense of its own identity and resisted hybridization. But William Dalrymple, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream this week.
Thank you, Ash. Very nice to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you for getting me out on time for my lunch. Thank you.